In this video, we're going to talk about a really important concept called the reasons to bet. And you definitely want to pay a lot of attention to this lecture because this is going to come up every single hand that you play. You're going to determine if you can bet or not for these primary reasons or not. So with that said, let's go ahead and let's get into it. In Texas Hold'em and in poker in general, there are only two primary reasons for betting. And let me go ahead and highlight this. And I'm going to say primary reasons because there may be some other secondary valid reasons for betting. But when we're talking about it for our primary reasons, betting for value, which is getting worse hands to call, and bluffing or semi-bluffing, which is getting better hands to fold, are the two primary reasons for betting. So before we move on with this lecture into the next slide, I do want to talk about some invalid reasons to bet. So I've heard these time and time again. I'm betting my hand. I'm pretty sure I have the best hand. I'm betting to see where I'm at. I'm betting to get information. And I'm betting so I don't get sucked out on. Those are common reasons that I've heard in the past, but they're not valid primary reasons for betting. And so in this course, we're going to focus on betting for value, commonly referred to as value betting, and bluffing / semi-bluffing. So with that said, let's get into it. So the first thing that I want to talk about is betting for value. And let's go ahead and jump to that slide. And this lecture may be a bit on the longer side because there is a lot of information to discuss. And I want to make sure that you fully understand these reasons to bet. So just be forewarned, but it seems like most of the videos so far in this section have been quite long. So betting for value. Betting for value is the first reason for betting in poker. And when we're talking about a value bet, it's a bet made for value. And more specifically, a bet that's made with a strong made hand with the intention of getting called by worse hands. And here's the goal, here's the caveat, getting called by worse hands. So when we're betting for value, we're not only betting what we believe to be the best hand, but we're expecting to get called by worse hands. So the goal of a value bet is to get our opponents to call with worse hands, i.e. to extract value. So whenever you say, or whenever you hear extracting value, that means that we're getting our opponents to call with a worse hand. So why is this important? Well, let's go ahead and jump to the next slide so I can talk about that. So betting for value versus betting the best hand. So betting the best hand isn't always the same thing as betting for value. And maybe that doesn't make sense now, but hopefully by the end of the slide it makes sense. So a lot of beginning poker players often make the mistake of thinking that betting the best hand is the same thing as betting for value, but they're not. So when we're betting the best hand, that just means we're betting the best hand. But are we considering the likelihood of our opponents calling? And if we're not, then we aren't properly value betting. So we have to consider the likelihood of our opponents calling with worse hands. And if we don't, then we're not value betting properly. Because remember, the goal of value betting is to get called by worse hands. And this is an area where a lot of people kind of get stuck on, is that they look at the board texture, they look at their hand, they consider their opponent's hand, and they say, oh, I have the best hand, so I'm going to value bet. But you have to ask the bigger question, well, can my opponent actually call? Should I bet here? If I call, are they likely to call with the worst hand? If they're not, and you bet, then you're not betting for value because you're getting them to fold instead. So when we bet for value, our goal is to extract value with our strong hands, not to make our opponents fold. And that's the kicker. So if you're betting the best hand and your opponent cannot call and they're going to have a high probability of folding, then that's not a good value bet. And this diagram here depicts it. So betting a strong hand plus likely to get called by worst hands equals a value bet. So just understand that. And as we go through the course, pay attention. And pay attention to the live play videos and the hand histories, because there's going to be situations where, let's say you flop a super strong hand. And let's say, for example, you flop a full house, or you flop quads, or you flop the nut straight, or you flop something maybe even as strong as a straight flush. And you have to ask yourself, should I bet on this flop, or should I check and give my opponent the ability to try to catch up with a semi-decent hand? Because I know they really can't call a bet now. And if you think about that, and if you think, well, okay, they probably can't call a bet now, and I have an invincible hand, then maybe I'll check and hope that they catch up and they think that I'm on a weaker hand, and we'll look to extract value on the turn and or the river. So we need to think about things like that. Now, there are going to be situations where our hand is a bit vulnerable, and we'll talk about that when we look at the post-flop play and the different board textures and everything, where we are probably going to err to the side of caution and bet with the best hand. And sometimes it's not going to be a pure value bet. It's going to be something that we call protection bet, which I'll talk about later in the course. But it's also a value bet. But it's not a true value bet in the sense that we know we're going to get called a lot. So anyways, I got off on a bit of a tangent, but let's go ahead and let's proceed with this. So getting back to betting for value, let's take a look at the spectrum of value betting hands. So in poker, there's a spectrum of value betting hands, which I have depicted here, where we have our strongest hands on one end of the spectrum, and then all the way down on the other end, we have our weakest hands. So for example, maybe we flopped a full house, and it's the best full house that you can flop. That's going to be our strongest hand. And then maybe there's a smaller full house that would be a strong hand, but it would be a little down the spectrum. Maybe our opponent flop trips, that'd be strong, but it's not the nuts, so it'd be around here. Maybe somebody just has two pair, it'd be over here. Maybe somebody has top pair, it'd be right here, and so forth, all the way down to maybe a 6 high. That would be our weakest hands. So we have to think about value betting and the strength of our hands in regards to this spectrum. And when we think about it, the easiest way is to think about our hands being on 3 different types of levels. Our strong value betting hands, our medium strength value betting hands, and something that we call our thin value betting hands. So of course, our strong value betting hands are hands where we have a very strong hand, and the likelihood that we are beat by our opponent is very, very unlikely. A medium strength hand, on the other hand, is a hand where we have a moderately strong hand that we expect to be about ahead of our opponent's calling range a decent percentage of the time, but not always. So maybe 65 or 70% of the time we expect to be ahead, but that other 40, 30, 35% of the time we expect to lose. And then there's something that we call our thin value betting hands, or we could simply call them our weak strength value betting hands. So this is going to be way down here. It's not going to be all the way down here. It's going to be somewhere around right here, because it has to be a made hand. So with our thin value bets, we're betting our mediocre strength hands, and these are made hands that will sometimes win and other times lose. And the goal with our thin value bets is to get our opponents to pay us off with even weaker hands than ours, hoping to get called by worse hands more often than when we get called by better hands, making our thin value bet profitable in the long run. And when I say profitable, I say marginally profitable. And you'll see this throughout the course as we get into the live play and the post-flop play. So there's going to be certain situations where we're playing against potentially a calling station, and they may call us with as weak as ace high or middle pair. And if we have a hand that beats them, we can thin value bet and expect to win, hopefully more often than we lose. All right, so that's the spectrum of value betting hands. Now let's talk about bluffing and semi-bluffing, the other primary reason for betting. And we're going to start off talking about our pure bluffs. So when we talk about bluffing, we typically just call them a pure bluff. So let's get into it. So what is a pure bluff? Well, there's the semi-bluff and there's the pure bluff. So the pure bluff is betting or raising with an inferior hand that has a very little chance of improving with the sole purpose of making our opponents fold a better hand. That's a pure bluff, right? We have the worst hand. We're either going to bet or we're going to raise, and we're betting or raising with the sole purpose of making our opponent fold a better hand. We have a very little likelihood of improving to beat them, so we just want to make them fold. We're just bluffing. And when we bluff, our main goal is to get our opponents to fold, and we call this our fold equity. So the fold equity is the percentage of time we expect our opponents to fold when facing a bet. The more often we expect them to fold, the more fold equity that we have. Now here's the thing with fold equity. We can estimate it if we have a HUD, and we can also estimate it based upon reads and tells in the style that our opponent is playing, but it's not something that we can hard calculate and have readily available. It's always going to be a guess. All right, so let me get rid of the highlighting and let's talk about pure bluffs some more. So remember, pure bluffs are hands that have a very little chance of improving to the best hand at showdown on the river. So these are hands, let's say for example, we 3-bet pre-flop as a bluff our opponent called, and we're representing a hand, but our actual hand has very little chance of improving. So whenever we are bluffing here with this 3-bet bluffing hand on the flop, our goal is to make our opponents fold a better hand a certain percentage of the time based on our bluff bet sizing. And this is the important thing. And let me go ahead and highlight this because we're going to talk about these bluff sizings a bit further in this lecture. So a common misconception with bluffing is that it needs to work a very high frequency at the time to be profitable, when in fact they actually don't. So a lot of people think that, okay, I tried to bluff my opponent, it didn't work, damn it, I'm not playing well. Well, here's the thing, your bluff doesn't need to work that often. So let's take a look at these. So I put together some common different bet sizes, and I calculated the break-even point for this bet size if they are a bluff. So if we decide a half pot size bet as a bluff, it only needs to win greater than 33% of the time to be profitable. 33% of the time, if our opponents are folding 1/3 of the time, then it's going to be break even. For a 3/4 pot size bet, our break even point is 43% of the time. And then for a full pot size bet, the break-even point is if our opponent is folding half of the time. So hopefully what you're seeing here is that bluffs don't have to work that often. So even with a full pot size bet, it only needs to work half the time in the long run to be break-even. So anything over half of the time, then it's profitable. Now we're not considering rake in here. Rake is going to make it so it needs to be a bit more, but just from a pure mathematical perspective, it doesn't need to work that often. So I want you to understand that, and I want you to take this to heart, because if you start implementing bluffs within your game, and let's say that you're betting a half pot size bet, and it only works 1 out of 3 different times against an opponent in a session, well, you know what? From a mathematical perspective, it was break even in terms of its success rate. But here's one thing. Understanding the math behind bluffs, meaning pure bluffs, doesn't always mean that you should bluff on the smaller side, right? Our intuition after looking at this is going to tell us, oh, well, a half pot size bet only needs to work 33% of the time. So maybe I should just bet that. Or maybe I'm only going to bet a 1/3 pot size bet because it only needs and I don't know the math off the top of my head, but it's going to be somewhere in the low 20%. So you're going to say, oh, well, maybe I should bet around 1/3 of a pot size bet because it rarely needs to work. Well, here's the thing. At the micro stakes, people are more likely to call than not call because a lot of our opponents are loose passive calling stations. So they see a small bet, they think, oh, it's not that much, I'm going to go ahead and call. What we should do instead is understand our opponents that we're playing against and devise an optimal bluff sizing that's the smallest amount that will make our opponents fold a high percentage of the time. So if we're playing against a calling station and we know that he's only folding a high percentage of the time to a full pot size bet, then that's probably what we should bet. But I'm going to talk about this a bit further later in this lecture. And I'm going to talk about bluffing at the micro stakes because just because I introduced this here doesn't mean that this gives you a license to bluff. And in fact, we probably shouldn't be bluffing at the lowest stakes that often for the main reason that I just talked about. Our opponents are calling stations, but I want to elaborate a bit further as well. So before we do that, I want to talk about semi-bluffing because semi-bluffing is going to be a tool that we're going to use a lot at the micro stakes. So what is a semi-bluff? Well, a semi-bluff is either betting or raising with a drawing hand such as a flush draw or an open-ended straight draw that has the potential to improve on later betting rounds to the best hand. So for example, if we flop an open-ended straight draw, or if we flop the nut flush draw with something like ace-10 suited, then we are going to semi-bluff. And the purpose of the semi-bluff is twofold. So the first is to, just like a normal bluff, is to make our opponents fold. So when we semi-bluff, we're perfectly happy if our opponents fold. However, if they call, the second reason is to build a pot for when we hit our draw. So this is where we are betting with a good drawing hand. We don't want to be semi-bluffing with a weak drawing hand. We typically want to semi-bluff with a good drawing hand. So if we have something like 9 outs with a flush draw, then we're going to make our hand a decent frequency of the time by the river. If we have a really strong draw, maybe we have a flush plus a straight draw, and we typically call these combo draws, and I'll talk about this a bit further as we get into the course, specifically when we talk about the post-flop section, then we definitely want to semi-bluff because the probability of hitting our draw goes up even further. So we want to build the pot. And the goal is that if our opponent calls, for the times that we hit the hand, we want to look to extract maximum value against them. So when we're semi-bluffing, we're using the likelihood that our opponent folding along with their drawing hand equity to make an aggressive play. So it's a combination of both, which you see down here. Fold equity, meaning the likelihood that they're going to fold, which we're totally fine with, plus our drawing hand equity for the times that they don't fold to make a semi-bluff. And again, when we get to the post-flop section, you're going to see all this in action, but I need you to understand this before we get to that section. So again, we're happy with them folding or we're happy with them calling. Either is fine. And you'll see me demonstrate this multiple different times throughout the course. So that is semi-bluffing. Now, before we end this lecture, I want to talk about bluffing at the micro stakes. So bluffing at the micro stakes, it's not going to play a significant role within our tight aggressive strategy, especially at the lowest micro stakes, such as 2NL, 4NL, 5NL, and 10NL. And the main reason being is our opponents. So here's the thing. Most of our opponents are going to be what I call a level 1 non-thinking poker player. So what does that mean? Well, these are the type of players that are only thinking about their hand and how it connects with the board, meaning the flop, the turn, and the river. They're not typically capable of putting us on a range of hands and generally don't realize it when they're beat. So for example, we may have an opponent that has an ace X hand. Maybe they have ace 4 offsuit. And actually let's just make it a little stronger. Let's say it's ace 9 offsuit. And they flop top pair with an ace, but somebody else potentially could have flopped a straight or flush or 2 pair that beats them, and their opponent is betting and betting and betting on each round. So they're betting the flop, they're betting the turn, and they're betting the river. And this person says, oh, I got a pair of aces. This is a good hand. So I'm going to call. And if we're bluffing them with a queen high, well, you know what? We just spewed off chips on the flop, the turn, and the river when they are never folding a pair of aces. So here's the thing. Bluffing against these type of opponents is not an effective strategy because they have a tendency to call too much, making pure bluffs unprofitable. So we need to pay attention to these type of players at the table. These are going to be our loose passive opponents. And in regards to them, they may be a calling station, they may not. And a person that has a weak ace hand, they may look at that as a strong hand. So they're not calling with a weak hand in their mind. They're calling with the pair of aces, which is the nut in their mind. So we need to pay attention to that. And this is why we typically aren't bluffing at the lowest micro stakes, because when we do that, we're just going to be giving chips away to them, and we don't want to do that. But on the flip side, we want to be value betting like crazy, and this is why most of our profits come from value betting at the micro stakes. Because how do we exploit our opponents' over tendency to call, to overvalue weak hands, to call as a calling station, to really not know when they're beat? We value bet. We don't bluff. So you can actually employ at the lowest stakes, you can employ a strategy where all you do is value bet and you don't bluff at all. And it's going to be fairly profitable. And this is something that I've actually done in some of my videos that I've had on my YouTube channel. I played sessions where I don't bluff or semi-bluff at all. I set rules up where I can only value bet, and of course it's profitable when I'm selecting the correct tables. So if we're not bluffing as a pure bluff that often, does that mean that we're not going to be semi-bluffing? No, actually, if we're going to be bluffing, we should primarily be semi-bluffing, because we want to be bluffing with equity, meaning drawing hand equity to potentially make the best hand. Because if our opponents aren't folding, we want to semi-bluff with a chance to win the hand at showdown with the best hand. However, with all that said, and let me get rid of all this highlighting because this is a bit of a different point. With all that said, when we do move up in stakes and when the rake becomes less expensive and people are more prone to fold, meaning we're playing against thinking players that are going to put us on specific ranges, and we can also give ourselves a perceived range, then that's when we can start incorporating bluffing within to our strategy, meaning pure bluffs in addition to our semi-bluffs and our value bets. And this makes us more quote-unquote unexploitable and more balanced, which is something that I'll touch on a little bit in this course, but it's not something that I'm going to teach in this course. So anyways, like I said, this was a fairly long lecture looking at close to 23 minutes. We talked about the reasons to bet, the primary reasons being value betting and bluffing / semi-bluffing at the micro stakes. Everything else, not a primary reason for betting at the micro stakes. So if you have any questions, let me know. If not, thanks for watching, and definitely remember all this stuff, because when we get to our pre-flop and post-flop sections of the course, I'm going to be referring to the different types that we're betting and whether it's a value bet, a pure bluff, or a semi-bluff as we progress in the course. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys at the next video. Take care.